Could you please help this new channel by liking and subscribing? As you see, most of you listening are not subscribing. It will really help the channel grow. Thank you so much. Okay, picture this. My best friend and I were heading out for a night on the town, all dressed up and ready to dance until dawn. We'd been planning this girl's night out for weeks, and we were beyond excited. We decided to splurge on an Uber, since neither of us wanted to deal with the hassle of driving or finding parking. When the car pulled up, we hopped in, giggling and chatting away like a couple of schoolgirls. At first, the driver seemed normal enough. He was an older guy, maybe in his 50s, with a gruff voice and a serious demeanor. We didn't pay him much attention, too caught up in our own conversation to really notice. But then, about halfway to the club, he started making these little comments under his breath. At first, I thought I must have misheard him. But then he did it again, louder this time. He was mumbling something about our outfits, about how we were dressed like a couple of cheap hookers. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I mean, sure, we were wearing short skirts and low-cut tops, but that didn't give him the right to judge us like that. My friend and I exchanged a worried look, but we didn't say anything. We just wanted to get to the club and forget about this creepy driver. But he wouldn't let up. He kept making these snide little remarks, getting bolder and nastier with each one. He started talking about our bodies, about how we were probably used to having men drool all over us. It was disgusting, and it made my skin crawl. I could see my friend starting to panic, her eyes wide with fear. I reached over and squeezed her hand, trying to reassure her that everything would be okay. But the truth was, I was freaking out too. This guy was clearly unhinged, and we were trapped in a car with him. I started to wonder if we'd made a terrible mistake, if we should have just stayed home and watched movies instead. The driver must have sensed our discomfort, because he started to get even more aggressive. He sped up, weaving in and out of traffic like a madman. I held on to the door handle for dear life, my heart pounding in my chest. And then he said the words that made my blood run cold. He told us that he knew a shortcut, a way to get to the club faster. But when he turned off the main road and onto a dark, deserted side street, I knew we were in trouble. My mind started racing, trying to come up with a plan. I couldn't let this creep take us somewhere remote, somewhere where no one would hear us scream. I had to do something, and fast. I leaned forward, pretending to adjust my shoe, but instead, I reached for the door handle, ready to jump out of the car if I had to. My friend saw what I was doing and nodded, her face pale with terror. The driver must have noticed something was up, because he slammed on the brakes, sending us lurching forward in our seats. He whipped around, his eyes blazing with anger. I don't remember exactly what he said, but it was something about teaching us a lesson, about showing us what happens to little teasers like us. I felt my stomach twist with fear, bile rising in my throat. But just as he was reaching for us, just as I was about to make a break for it, a pair of headlights appeared in the rearview mirror. Another car was coming up behind us fast. The driver cursed under his breath and sped off, taking a sharp turn back onto the main road. I let out a shaky breath, my heart still racing. We rode the rest of the way to the club in silence, the driver white-knuckling the steering wheel and muttering to himself. When we finally got there, we practically dove out of the car, not even bothering to say thank you. We stumbled into the club, our legs shaking and our minds reeling. We tried to lose ourselves in the music, in the pulsing beat and the flashing lights. But the memory of that ride, of that creepy driver and his leering eyes, wouldn't leave us alone. We stayed out for a few hours, but our hearts just weren't in it anymore. All we wanted was to go home, to crawl into bed and forget this whole awful night had ever happened. When we finally called another Uber to take us back, we triple-checked the driver's rating and made sure to sit in the back seat, as far away from him as possible. We barely said a word the whole way home, too shaken up to even try to make conversation. That night changed something in me, in both of us. It made us realize how vulnerable we were, how easily a fun night out could turn into a nightmare. It made us more cautious, more wary of strangers in dark streets. But it also made us stronger, in a way. It showed us that we could survive something scary, something that shook us to our core. It taught us to trust our instincts, speak up when something doesn't feel right. Alright, so here's the deal. I was heading home after a night out with my buddies, and I decided to call an Uber. I was pretty tired and maybe a little buzzed, so I didn't think twice when I punched in my address and confirmed the ride. The driver seemed normal enough at first. He was quiet, but that wasn't unusual. I leaned back in my seat and scrolled through my phone, not really paying attention to where we were going. But after a while, I started to realize that something wasn't right. We were driving down this dark, deserted road, and I couldn't see any familiar landmarks. I sat up straight, suddenly alert. I asked the driver where we were going, but he just grunted something unintelligible. I felt a prickle of unease crawl up my spine. And then he turned off the main road entirely onto this narrow, bumpy path that seemed to lead nowhere. I gripped the edge of my seat, my heart starting to race. Finally, the car lurched to a stop. I looked out the window and felt my stomach drop. We were parked in front of this old, crumbling building with boarded-up windows and graffiti-covered walls. It looked like something out of a horror movie. I turned to the driver, ready to demand an explanation, but he was already getting out of the car, slamming the door behind him. I sat there for a moment, frozen with indecision. Should I stay in the car and lock the doors? Should I make a run for it? I had no idea where I was or how far I'd have to go to find help. But then I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a scraping, shuffling noise like something being dragged across the ground, and it was coming from outside the car. I made a split-second decision. I flung open the door and bolted, my feet pounding against the dirt path. I could hear heavy footsteps behind me, getting closer and closer. I ran blindly, my lungs burning and my heart pounding. I had no idea where I was going, but I knew I had to get away from whoever or whatever was chasing me. And then, out of nowhere, a figure loomed up in front of me. I skidded to a stop, my breath catching in my throat. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, with a face that was half hidden in shadow. He was holding something in his hand, something that glinted in the moonlight. I backed away slowly, my hands held up in front of me. I tried to speak, to beg for mercy, but my voice wouldn't work. The man advanced on me, his movements slow and deliberate. I could see the whites of his eyes, the flash of his teeth as he grinned. I braced myself for the worst, my mind racing with all the things I should have done differently. I should have been more careful, should have paid attention to where the Uber was taking me. Now it was too late. But just as the man was about to lunge at me, a pair of headlights swept across the scene. A car was approaching fast. The man hesitated, squinting into the glare, and in that moment, I made my move. I threw myself to the side, rolling in the dirt and scrambling to my feet. I ran towards the car, waving my arms and screaming for help. To my amazement, the car screeched to a halt. The window rolled down, and I saw the concerned face of a middle-aged woman. I practically dove into the passenger seat, babbling incoherently about the Uber driver and the abandoned building and the man with a knife. The woman listened patiently, her eyes wide with shock. She called the police and stayed with me until they arrived. I was shaking and crying, my clothes torn and dirty. But I was alive, and that was all that mattered. The police searched the area, but they found no sign of the Uber driver or the man who had chased me. It was like they had vanished into thin air. I gave my statement and then called a real taxi to take me home. I collapsed into bed, my mind reeling with the events of the night. That was a year ago, and I still have nightmares about that abandoned building and the man with the knife. I don't know what would have happened if that woman hadn't shown up when she did. But I do know one thing, I'll never take an Uber again, not after that night. I'd rather walk or take the bus or call a friend for a ride. because you never know who might be behind the wheel or where they might take you. And in this crazy, messed up world, that's a risk I'm just not willing to take anymore. It all started when I landed this huge job interview, the kind of once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that could change everything for me. I've been busting my ass for weeks, practicing my answers and perfecting my resume. I was nervous as hell, but I knew I was ready. I decided to call an Uber, figuring it would be the easiest way to get there without stressing over parking or traffic. The driver who picked me up seemed like a decent enough guy, just your average Joe trying to make a few bucks. We made small talk for a bit, swapping stories about the crazy weather and the never-ending construction downtown. But then, about halfway to my destination, the driver suddenly pulled off the main road and into this rundown gas station. It was the kind of place you usually avoid, with flickering lights and a bunch of sketchy-looking dudes hanging around outside. The driver mumbled something about needing to use the restroom and told me to wait in the car. I wasn't thrilled about it, but I figured I didn't have much choice. I watched as he disappeared into the grimy building, the door swinging shut behind him. At first, I just scrolled through my phone, trying to distract myself from the nerves that were starting to build up in my stomach. But as the minutes ticked by, I started to get antsy. I checked my watch obsessively, watching as the time for my interview got closer and closer. I craned my neck, trying to see through the gas station windows, but they were too dirty and smudged to make out much of anything. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that the driver should have been back by now. I started to run through all the possible scenarios in my head, each one worse than the last. Maybe the driver had some kind of medical emergency, like a heart attack or a stroke. Maybe he'd gotten into a fight with one of those scary-looking dudes outside. Or maybe, and this was the thought that really made my skin crawl, maybe he just decided to ditch me and take off with my fare. I knew I couldn't just sit there forever, waiting and worrying. My interview was getting closer by the second, and I couldn't afford to be late. But I also couldn't just abandon the car and try to find another ride. We were miles from the nearest town, and I had no idea how to get where I needed to go. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. I knew I had to do something, even if it meant taking a risk. I stepped out of the car, my legs wobbling a bit as I stood up. The air outside was hot and sticky, and I could feel sweat starting to trickle down the back of my neck. I walked towards the gas station, trying to project an air of confidence even though I was shaking like a leaf inside. I pushed open the door, wincing at the harsh fluorescent lights and the sour smell of old coffee. I looked around, but there was no sign of the driver. The only other person in the place was a pimply-faced teenager behind the counter, flipping through a magazine with a bored expression. I approached him cautiously, clearing my throat to get his attention. I asked if he'd seen the guy who'd come in a few minutes ago, but he just shrugged and shook his head, barely glancing up from his magazine. I could feel my frustration mounting, but I tried to keep my cool. I described the driver as best I could, hoping that maybe the kid had seen something he wasn't remembering. But no matter how much I pressed him, he just kept giving me that same blank stare like he couldn't be bothered to care. I was just about to give up and head back to the car when something caught my eye. There, lying on the ground near the door, was a cell phone. It looked like the same model as the one I'd seen the driver using earlier. I bent down to pick it up, my hands shaking a bit as I turned it over. The screen was cracked, but I could still make out a notification flashing urgently on the lock screen. It was a message from someone named Boss, and the preview text made my blood run cold. Job's done. Meet at the usual spot. Bring the car. I stared at the screen, my mind reeling. What the hell did that mean? What kind of job was the driver doing? And what did it have to do with me, with the car I was supposed to be in right now? I looked around wildly, suddenly feeling like I was being watched. The gas station seemed to loom around me, sinister and threatening. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd stumbled into something way over my head, something dangerous that I wasn't supposed to know about. I knew I had to get out of there and fast. I shoved the phone into my pocket and ran back to the car, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I jumped into the driver's seat, my hands fumbling with the keys. I'd never driven this kind of car before, but I didn't have time to worry about that now. I just needed to put as much distance as possible between myself and that creepy gas station. I peeled out of the parking lot, the tires screeching against the pavement. I had no idea where I was going, but I just kept driving, my mind racing with all the terrible possibilities of what might have happened to the driver. I drove for hours, watching as the sun sank lower and lower in the sky. I knew I'd missed my interview, but that seemed like the least of my problems now. I was in full-on panic mode, jumping at every shadow and flinching at every sound. When I finally made it back to the city, I was a wreck. I ditched the car in the first crowded parking lot I could find and called the cops with a shaking voice. I told them everything, from the moment the driver disappeared to the cryptic message on his phone. Thank you all for listening in. If you haven't already, then please like and subscribe and help this new channel grow. It's free and means a lot.